The Sony A6700 versus the Sony FX30. Two cameras with the same sensor, but have completely different experiences. So in what ways are you getting the same camera?
Image quality is the same, as it is the exact same sensor with the same 14 plus stops of dynamic range. You're getting good low light performance with the backside illuminated sensor on both of these cameras. Plus, you'll be happy to know that unlike other Sony APS-C cameras, you'll also be getting dual base ISOs at 800 and 2500 for better image quality. Another thing to note about the sensor is that when you're shooting 4K 120, you'll also have another 1.5 times crop on both cameras. When it comes to stabilization, both of these cameras have IBIS, giving you standard and active stabilization. You'll also be getting another 1.1 times crop when using active stabilization. When it comes to leveraging the image quality with the autofocus, this is where things start to differ. Fortunately for Sony A6700 users, they have the benefit of using AI to track their subjects. This is especially most evident when pairing this feature with clear image zoom. When you use clear image zoom with the Sony FX30, yes, there's autofocus, but no face or eye autofocus like you would have with the Sony A6700.
Is AI autofocus important for you?
On the outside, both of these cameras are dust and moisture resistant. Yes, even for the Sony FX30 with its fans. I personally don't recommend bringing your cameras in harsh environments to test such weather resistance, but every now and then I catch myself in light rain, and my cameras have had no problems. Right away when you pick up both of these cameras, you'll notice that the grip on the Sony FX30 is quite beefy. It felt like I was holding another A7S III because of how deep the grip was. But when it comes to the variety of buttons, the Sony FX30 has the most buttons with potential to remap and customize if you'd wish. You have dedicated buttons for shutter speed, aperture, ISO, white balance, focus magnification, focus peaking, and more. Plus you have your own dedicated zoom rocker. If you're used to having a mode dial, you'll notice that the Sony FX30 has switched to a mode button that allows you to cycle through the different modes. However, the Sony A6700 doesn't just offer a single mode dial, but it also adds another dial for shooting modes.
Both allow for keeping separate settings for photo and video, but the Sony FX30 is allowing only 5 different custom settings, whereas the Sony A6700 provides up to 16. Wow. And that's because of the dual dial system that they got here.
For the Sony A6700, I have my buttons customized for white balance, focus peaking, and clear image zoom. This camera may not have as many buttons as the Sony FX30, but I have enough custom modes to make up for it. This isn't a button, but when you are recording, the Sony FX30 has 3 tally lights. One on the top record button, one square in front of the camera, and if you count it as a tally light, the screen itself. When you hit record on the Sony A6700, you have the bottom blinking lights and the screen. When it comes to ports, both of these have microphone jacks and headphone jacks, but that's about it when it comes to sharing the same ports, because the Sony FX30 has a full HDMI, whereas the Sony A67 has a mini HDMI.
Many will say they prefer the full-size HDMI, particularly the pros who want a more reliable and rugged cable. But of course, if you really want to shoot more photos than video, or are okay with the flip-out screen, then mini HDMI won't bother you much.
If anything, the problem with using HDMI at all on these cameras is finding the right cord. If you're using the Sony FX30, I highly recommend using a right angle HDMI cable so it's out of your way. One of the most recent updates to the Sony cameras is USB live streaming, where you only need a USB-C cord to start using your camera as a webcam. Both of these cameras shoot 4K, but the Sony A6700 shoots with 4K 30, whereas the FX30 only shoots up to 4K 15 frames per second. Fortunately, you are able to use both of these cameras as a webcam and are able to record your footage to your SD card too for redundancy. You just need to turn this feature on in camera.
Because your camera will be plugged into your laptop, you should have no problems when it comes to battery life if you'll be recording some kind of live stream or podcast. However, overheating will be a problem.
The Sony FX30 has fans, whereas the Sony A6700 does not. So if you're planning to record your videos on your SD card, I would recommend shooting 1080 for anything longer than an hour on your A6700, just to be safe. Both of these cameras are excellent when it comes to photography. Although it's strange to say that your cinema camera, the Sony FX30, can be used for a maternity photo shoot. I've done this and the image quality has been fantastic with my Sigma 30mm f1.4. However, just because you can do photo shoots with the Sony FX30 doesn't mean you should. When it comes to paid gigs, I prefer to use a camera with dual SD card slots, where I have both RAW and JPEG photos written simultaneously to both cards. But for day trips, I'm not really stressing about whether I have 1 or 2 SD cards. Although both of these cameras can get the photo job done, I would say that I favor more towards the Sony A6700. Yes, it's got the viewfinder, but if you shoot a lot of indoor events, you'll lean more towards the A6700 because of its mechanical shutter. I love the Sony FX30, but one of the gripes that I have about it is the bending I get every now and then. I have to bring my shutter speed down to 1/25th of a second just to avoid it. This is fine for most things, especially having IBIS to keep the sensor steady, but I like to be able to crank that shutter a little bit more just to lessen any motion blur and maximize the sharpness.
With the Sony A6700, this isn't a problem because of the mechanical shutter. As long as you aren't switching to a silent shutter, banding shouldn't be a problem for you.
Other than that, if you're shooting action shots, you'll prefer the continuous shooting of the Sony A6700 because the FX30 won't give it to you. I do have a workaround for this continuous shooting, but it involves faster shutter speeds and spamming that shutter button. When it comes to general use, I enjoy using the Sony FX30 in a studio setting, and I'm able to just burn in my LUTs and not have to worry about editing afterwards because my look is consistent throughout. When I use this at church or on other video work, this is my workhorse, as I can easily throw this on a gimbal, leave it on sticks, or even build it up with a rig if I need to. But where it starts being less fun is during travel. Ideally, I would love to use the Sony FX30 with a Sony 16 to 55mm f2.8, but that already is a beefy setup. So instead, I prefer to travel with the Sony A6700 with the Sigma 30mm f1.4 or the Sony 18 to 105 f4, as both setups allow for a more compact and light carry. I easily shoot photos and videos with this setup, especially when the dials make it so easy for me to go from shooting photos and then immediately go shooting 4K 60 and S-Log3 10-bit with the flip of a dial or two.
Since the Sony A6700 is plenty enough and does a lot of what the Sony FX30 does, should you get this instead? Well, even though the Sony A6700 in many ways is like the Sony FX30, but if you prioritize photography then video, you'll most likely be choosing this camera for its mechanical shutter to prevent banding, the viewfinder for sunnier weathers, and continuous shooting. For $400 more than this, the Sony FX30 is surely a more pro camera for the features that it provides, like no overheating, which is great for long record times like wedding ceremonies and hour-long podcasts. You got dual SD cards so that you can back up your photos and footage just in case. And then of course, you got all those extra video features like anamorphic squeezes, Cine EI, and more. Plus, if you're willing to spend another $400, you could also add in the Sony XLR top handle, but it's better to get it with the camera than to buy it separate. Both of these cameras are great as alternatives to full frame cameras because of all the features packed into both of them. But when it comes to spending the least while getting the best, the Sony A6700 is a great choice as a hybrid camera. But if you're getting paid for your video work and you're willing to invest in reliability and more functionality without investing to full frame, the Sony FX30 is the better of the two. I ended up leaving my A7S III for the FX30 and I don't regret it. Click over here to see why I made the switch.